Proverbs 16:9. We need to make plans. Those plans change, and it's God who establishes our steps. Ultimately, God decides our direction and blesses us. We also are talking about a process of loving our neighbors, getting into the lives of people who are near us, people who are struggling. Doesn't take far to look to realize there are people really struggling in life. We need to get into their lives, and we need to move them to love God. And then we need to move them and link arms with people, and we need to serve other people together. How many of you have heard it's kind of a rhetorical question. How many of you have heard the saying, sweat, blood, and tears? How many of you have lived life through sweat, blood, and tears? We all probably have spent a lot of sweat, blood, and tears. In other words, we've put time and effort into something, developing some kind of a craft or working on some kind of a job or some kind of a degree or multiple degrees or whatever it is. We've worked to get to a point where we're sustainable, and we've kind of developed this craft or this job or this profession or whatever it is. And a lot of the times we get knocked back along the way, and sometimes we get into what we think is our dream job or whatever it is, and we find out that, well, okay, I just spent the last 15 years of my life, of my short life on this earth, and that's not really what I want to be when I grow up. Some of us have probably been through this cycle. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens too for the people who stick it out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but right now I want to talk about something interesting that's happening out there in the world, in the job force, culturally, since COVID. And I think it's fascinating as we look at the text and what the text is telling us today and what God is saying is true for all of eternity, and kind of contrasting that with what's going on out in the job force, out in the world. I've been watching a little bit of a couple interviews by Mike Rowe, who is just a fascinating guy to begin with, but he had the show Dirty Jobs and kind of highlighted all these jobs that pay really well and that are necessary for structure, for people like us to enjoy flushing a toilet. And, you know, we have this infrastructure. There are dirty jobs out there that we don't think about whenever we flush a toilet. We just think, well, you know, it works or it doesn't work. And then we get mad if somebody, you know, we call somebody and they're not there to fix it. But he's been doing recent interviews, and he's really alarmed at what's happening right now. Right now, currently, there are 11 million available jobs, and that's entering into a deep recession. Still, there are 11 million jobs that are available right now that people cannot find employment. Those jobs are available. They're readily available. People could literally walk into these jobs yesterday. 11 million jobs available. At the same time, there are 7 million able-bodied men between the ages of 25 and 54 who are not working. They've exited the job force, and they've done it permanently. 7 million able-bodied men not only not willing to work, but they're actively not looking for employment. And so Mike Rowe said this. This is a quote in one of the interviews that he did. He said, "This is unprecedented. We've never had this much unrealized opportunity and so many people unwilling to work." I find that fascinating because I think this is permeated everywhere. And I think if we could scream one thing from the top of the mountain, it's where are the men? In the church, this has been probably an issue for decades. Where are the men? Not that men aren't there. They're certainly there, but are they willing to work? Able-bodied men, are they willing to work? And I think this is interesting, and Mike Rowe said, we really don't know because it's unprecedented in the workforce. We don't know what's going to happen to our infrastructure, which depends on people turning wrenches and people out there, people welding, and like it requires that. Bridges require it. He talked about plumbers. He said right now, one of the number one jobs that has the biggest shortage is plumbers, and people call a plumber and they can't find anybody, and they're like, it's not like a minor inconvenience. And he said, unless you have an outhouse that's already dug and it's outside as a backup, you kind of need your plumbing system to work. And there aren't people in the job force right now. There's a massive shortage. And I thought it was interesting too. Cameron and I this summer we're coming down 219. We see this Lamborghini Huracan go by, and I mentioned it. I said to Dave about it. Dave goes, "Oh, I know who that is." He's like, "It's a plumber." This guy's driving a Lamborghini, a local guy. It's a lucrative job. The jobs are there. They're available. The money's there. But there aren't people willing to work. But when we do work on something, when we work on a skill, whether it's a skill, whether it's a sport, working on baseball for hours on end, whatever it is, working on piano, working on an instrument, when we work on something and we put a lot of sweat, blood, and tears into it, at the end of the day, we step back and we say, I did this. There's a certain craft that goes into that goes into, again, the education, the work, the finished product. When we can step back, we can say, I did that. What's interesting is Paul kind of turns this around. He spins that around and he says, we are God's workmanship. That God crafted us, that God made us, that God put his sweat, blood, and tears into making us, and it's for a very specific purpose. So we're going to look at the entirety of this passage because I think it's really important. It starts in Ephesians 2, verse 1. Paul says, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and we were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. I want to pause here for a second because I thought it was interesting what Mike Rowe said about what's going on in the job force, what's going on out in the world, so to speak. He said these people, these 7 million able-bodied men who are actively not working and not looking for work, he said another interesting phenomenon is happening at the same time. They're spending on average in a year about 2,000 hours on the screen. So he said they which is about the same if you work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks out of the year, it's about the same amount of time. So he said their full-time job effectively is to just waste time. He talked about scrolling through TikTok, and they spend 8 hours a day, on average, 8 hours a day on a screen. And Paul here is saying that they didn't have screens back then, but Paul's talking about worldly things. You guys were worldly at one point. You were following the way of the world. You were like that. You followed the passions of our flesh. You were carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. You are by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. Verse 4, but God being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you've been saved. He pulled us out of that. He pulled us out of those passions and those worldly passions. By grace you've been saved and raised up. He raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. In other words, he put you on display to show his power and his might and his finished product. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are His workmanship. We are His sweat, blood, and tears. We are His finished product, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. I think it's one of the most profound passages really in all of the Bible, that we were created by God through His sweat, blood, and tears for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. The question is, why are so many people not working? I'm not just talking about out there in the workforce. I'm talking about Christians who are not working. And I'm not talking about specifically our congregation. I'm saying generally, getting the big picture, people are checked out. They're checked out of their jobs. They're checked out of Christianity. They're checked out of whatever it is. We have stay-at-home Christians now. That people who choose, they say they're Christian, but they stay home and they don't get involved. They don't work. They don't join arms with other Christians. This is happening all over the world. And I think this has been exacerbated since COVID, but the good news is that we are God's workmanship, that God created us for good works. I don't think that I say this all the time, I don't think that we're at a point where we should throw in the towel and be like, oh, well, if you can't beat them, join them. I don't think that's at all the message that Christians ought to have. I just read something this morning about the minister, and I always forget his name. He's the guy in Chicago he's been living up on the roof now for 344 days. He's trying to raise something like $50 million to build this massive building, and he's going to take people out of the hood and educate them and give them work skills, and he's going to teach them about Christ, and he's going to put them out in the workforce. I think it's so cool and so incredible and so inspirational. That's his workmanship. You think he's getting knocked back a little bit along the way? I'd say so. But he's putting his sweat, blood, and tears into it. And the end result is this beautiful picture. And he said people are going out here, people who had no hope. People now are turning to Christ. These young men and these young ladies are turning to Christ. And they're entering into the workforce, and they're being professionals, and they're raising and supporting families now. And there's a guy who, I can't remember his name, but I saw this video and it just kind of caught my attention. He said, how many times are you willing to get knocked down and get back up again? He said, those who stick it out to the very end and who learn from their mistakes along the way, those are the people who will thrive. The problem is, I think too many people give up prematurely, and they're like, well, that's not going to work. And they forget that we are God's workmanship, that God created us for good works. This is what we need to model to our kids. We need to model it and show them, instead of sitting at home and, stuffing our face full of chips and sitting on the couch and, that's your profession. We need to show our kids that we were created for good works in Christ Jesus. We're God's workmanship. And I hope that Christians will start getting this message, and that people will go out, and this cycle that we talk about, it's not complicated, it's not hard, it's not something that's unattainable, it's not something that's so far off and so far-fetched that there's no way we can ever accomplish that. It's super easy. You can literally recite it in 2 seconds. Loving neighbors, loving God, serving others. It's that easy. But so many people aren't doing it. They're waiting for that next big thing. They're waiting for the next big break. They're waiting for something that will fill their cup. They're waiting for whatever it is, the grass being greener on the other side. I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand it. But I think the important thing is to realize that we were gifted with salvation. Do you realize how amazing that is? We were gifted with salvation, and we are God's workmanship, created to do good works and to bless other people. Again, I'm going to send you out this week with that message. We have Thanksgiving coming up. We have a lot of lonely people right now. A lot of lonely people who are going to spend Thanksgiving alone. Find somebody and bless them. I'm not saying you have to make Thanksgiving meal for them and invite them into your home, but just think of people. Let people know that you're thinking of them. Call them. Send them a card. We have people in this congregation who are widowers. They're spending Thanksgiving without their spouse. Think of them. Let them know that you care and that you remember. There's so much that we can be doing for people, and I just hope and pray that we realize the gravity of this message that Paul gives us in Ephesians 2.